There.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Nietzsche podcast. In this edition, we are talking about the will to power, which is one of the prominent concepts that in philosophy that Nietzsche talks about. And before we start and get into this beautiful conversation, we would like to first preface with a quick definition and understanding of what the will to power is. And I would say the best definition of what the will to power is this innate irrational force that is found in every single one of us that allows us that pinpoints exactly or gives a reason for every action that we make. And an example and a parallel that we were just talking about was a plant. A plant needs certain things in order for it to grow and capitalize on in order to be able to grow. And what it does is it exploits life in general to get certain nutrients, to get water, to get proper soil, et cetera, to then be able to grow. And that's what the will to power is all about. It's about exploiting life, which sounds kind of messed up, but that's really what it is. It's about this innate willingness and this innate feeling of exploiting life in order to just be able to grow and distinguish ourselves apart from everyone else on this earth. So
Yeah. So the way Nietzsche he talks about it, well, he's like something to the effect of will to power is the will to life. It goes back to what Mikhail was saying, is that if you look at things like everything in the age is non-living, but the thing that separates non-living from living is the will to power, because the will to power drives every thought, drives every thing you do. It's instead of just like sitting back and like will to power allows you to actually, like, if your plant is to grow, to reproduce, to try to seek nutrients, oxygen, it's the will to act upon your life and will to get to where your end goal, which is like, again, because I think you're talking before about the concept of personal truths and how it's in everybody's powers them to go on their journey towards their truth.
Yeah.
How do we think that will to power relates to the idea of extreme ownership?
You want to start?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question. I think the will to power, like going back to what Ahan said first, the will to power as Nietzsche conceives of it is neither good or bad, right? And it is a basic drive found in everyone, but one that expresses itself in many different ways. And so every single human being has this direct will to power into a will of truth. And examples of that could be like artists, right? The artists channel into a will to create, or businessmen, they satisfy it through becoming more rich, right? And so that's sort of what their like truths are. And then now extrapolating that to Zane's question, in which it comes down to extreme ownership. And extreme ownership is basically how we're taking ownership for every action that we're making, right? And every action that we're doing. And I think to understand that, God damn it, man.
I think it's will the extreme ownership is like Mikhail says, we're taking ownership and of all the actions taken. And your will to power is your innate drive and your factor that pushes you towards your truth, right? So then when you look at every action you take, no matter how small, is driven by the will to power. So then it is extreme ownership in itself, because it's saying that everything you do is yours. It's your personal, it's like you're the one who's doing it, and it's driven by you. So there's nothing like you can't blame anybody else. It's all you. Will to power is an internal concept. It's not that someone else's will to power affects yours. It's your will to power is around your journey. So it's all around you. So extreme ownership is going back to the fact that every action you do is driven by you. So it is yours.
And even so, when I think about building up will to power, at least the way that I'm thinking about it is if will to power is about how far you can take yourself based on tolerance of different hard things or based on different new things that you previously weren't exposed to. I think it's interesting where a lot of people might not have as much will to power because they're not willing to go through the pain of doing hard things, whether that be mental pain or physical pain. And so now we're thinking about what are the different characteristics or things that propel us to do hard things just within our own daily lives, but then how do people that climb Mount Everest or do other hard things in their daily life, what type of will to power do they have? Because we all have some form of will to power, but they have a different one. And I don't think that it's just directly correlated to their mind thinks about everything differently. I think that they've built up their will to power in so many different stages that now they have more. And it's as if you're just building up a bank. So you're building up a bank or this large stash of cash, except cash. Now we're resystematizing it or retagging it to be will to power. And so it's how much will to power can you build up over the process of building up as many pain points, if that makes sense.
Why do you think, before we move on, will to power is different per person? Couldn't it just be that will to power is standard? It can be developed, but it's more what their personal truth and value is. Because someone who watches Netflix all day, their personal truth, their values may be different from someone who climbs Everest. But the will to power to do those actions are the same, right?
But will to power is all about how much pain are you willing to endure in order to get an end goal. So watching Netflix, you wouldn't have any pain in that process. I think you would actually just be suffering. And suffering is that process, which I think Nietzsche talks about this as well. There's pain, and then so pain is inevitable, suffering is not optional. And so the suffering part, I guess you would somewhat have that in Netflix because, well, actually, I don't know how that relates, but I guess in terms of why every person has a different will to power, I think it's because of the different experiences that people have. So pre-podcast, Michael mentioned that it is innate. So we know that everybody has some form of will to power, but what's interesting is how people manifest that. So if everyone has it, how are they learning about the different places that they can use it in their life? How are they learning on how to expand it in their life? And I think that all comes through some form of lived experience where you can build up more and more power. Think about cancer patients in relation to us. They have to go through intensive chemotherapy, but their will to power is at a different level than ours is because we haven't lived through that. And so I think they now have, it's not even about having more endurance than us. They just have a bigger threshold of how much pain they can take than we do. And that's what we need to build up in different ways as well.
And that's exactly it. I think it was the genealogy of morals or something like that. And Nietzsche was basically talking about like master morality and then slave morality, and then how both of those trace back to the will to power. And so what happens is that we create this table of like values, and then we impose them on people and then judge the world according to them. So, and what this basically does is that what Nietzsche was trying to do with this book was basically attempt to understand and evaluate various different moral systems. And what happens is that the strong and healthy, like the masterly type, confidently impose their values on people and the world directly, right? So that comes down to like people who want to climb Mount Everest, and they're documenting the whole thing, and they're going up Mount Everest, right? And then what happens is that the people with like the weak, by contrast, like the weak morality, by contrast, seek to impose their values in a more like cunning or like roundabout way. But every single person wants to impose their table of values, and they all have a will to power it, but it's about their approach in order to get to that level. So Han and I could maybe have a very similar like truth, and like, which is not like maybe not necessarily true, but like what like person A and person B could have a very the same truth in regards to what success looks like and what sort of actions we want to take on a daily basis, but judging based off of our morality and our morals, then, and whether or not one is stronger than the other, we will go about the will to power in various different ways.
Mm-hmm. And do we think that willpower is enough? Or having a will to power, do we think that that's enough in order to achieve unconventional things? Or do we think that there are other parts of will to power that need to be attached on in order to achieve unconventional success?
What do you actually cut out? Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So what I was mentioning was, do we think willpower is what other ingredients in addition to willpower allow us to achieve unconventional success? Do we think willpower is the only one, or what other ones consist of that? And I guess part of it might be a little off topic, moving more into what Nietzsche talks about with Ubermesh, which is how do you become superhuman and how do you become above yourself? Back to what you were mentioning earlier, Mikhail. But what other parts can we add to willpower in order to reach a state of Ubermesh, or in order to reach a state where we feel unstoppable based on these different philosophies or mental models that we have?
What do you think, Zane?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I don't think willpower alone is enough. I think that you can sustain a level of pain, mental, emotional, whatever that pain is, and part of that can allow you to achieve success. Because I think that there are a couple parts of it. One part of the will to power is you understand your own limits. And when you understand your own limits, I think you can gain more self-awareness on what you need to do, what action items can you have in order to achieve your next limitation. So if I go climb Mount Rainier here in Seattle, Washington, for example, I've essentially expended all the will to power that I have just on climbing this one mountain. And so now that's my limitation. I know that Mount Rainier is my limitation, but if I want to go climb Mount Everest, I have to go back and refresh and extend my will to power to then go climb another mountain and then move up to Mount Everest. And I think that requires other characteristics that are independent of will to power, but that's another, I think, topic in terms of how are you extending it. And then I think other parts of it are the more will to power you have, I think will to power actually locks really well with creativity or innovation. And the reason I say that is because I think you aren't worried about the smaller things that most other people tend to be worried about, because you understand your pain threshold. You understand that you can engage in both hard and easier things. And so you don't concern yourself with all of the worries that most people have, because you understand yourself as well. And so I think that those are the two main characteristics that attach to will to power. But how that relates to Ubermesh, or even my initial question, I think it's interesting because the more will to power you have it, I think that the closer you are to Ubermesh. But I think why will to power is so important is because it allows you to understand yourself better. And when you understand yourself better, like I mentioned, you understand your limitations, you understand where you can be successful, you understand how much pain you can endure en route to doing something that you think will make you successful or you think will make you happy. I think you have an advantage over others, because others won't understand all of their limitations and they'll fail or they'll stop before they actually reach the point that is hard for them. Will Smith talks about this a lot, and it was actually part of one of the rabbit holes I went through as part of the self-discipline guide that we did. And it was, he mentioned that we're always in a battle with our own mind, where our mental and emotional limits are one step ahead of our physical limits. And so the phrase that he lives by is one more go. And he'll always do one more rep, whether he's in the gym, or he'll do one more run if he's on a sprint, one more mile, whatever that looks like. And I think will to power is similar, because we know what our threshold is, but there's a level beyond that. And the people that understand that, and the people that are comfortable enough with themselves and have enough self-awareness, they can go that extra route. And it's interesting because I think that this also relates, before I throw it to you guys, but this also relates to one thing that Thomas Frank was mentioning as part of Jack Butcher's visualized value post. So Jack Butcher has this graph, and he has little pencil-like lines. Okay, so he has one line that's smaller, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And most people stop at this point. Most people stop here because they've done 10 to 12 different reps and they haven't achieved the massive line. That massive line is success or some form of inflection. And I think the will to power also relates to that, because it's how many times can you continue going? How much pain, again, can you endure before you reach a point of success? And do you know what that is? And are you willing to stay in the game long enough to achieve personal satisfaction? Or are you going to balance at rep 14 out of 20 and not wait to get there?
Exactly. And this is actually what Nietzsche talks a lot about. It's like that overall idea. He devotes so much attention with will to power to actually like self-overcoming, right? So the will to power is harnessed and directly like towards being able to gain like a level of self-mastery and self-transformation. And there was this quote, it's like your real self lies not deep within, trying to remember, not deep within you, but high above you, right? So it's that overall idea of, you know, self-overcoming and, you know, getting to that level of understanding and also being aware of yourself. And I think that's interesting because Zane, me and you, and then also Han was super interested in this a few days ago. It's that overall idea of even just gaining a level of obsession, right? And also being able to continuously get that drive to actually continue to level up and, you know, get to that next level. And I think that this is actually a huge part of it. It's knowing sort of what your threshold is in a sense, and knowing, you know, what lies above you if you take a certain path. And then from there, start to understand, as you start to work from there, then try to increase that threshold and start to overcome sort of your innate limitation or your biological limitation, right? To get to where you want to be.
Yeah, exactly. So I think one question, Zane, you mentioned a really good point about how, and also Mikhail, is that you need, apart from your initial question about what are the other ingredients, you need an obsession with your vision. Because in the end, if you're willing to endure through all of the hardships and all your things you have to take, especially pushing the threshold, discipline and motivation, I think they're used wrong. Additional motivation, one part, but it's more in a complete obsession with your vision that allow you to push yourself one further, do the extra rep, go the next mile. So I think in terms of your question, you need to have anti-fragility, not be worried about is it concept of stoicism, but it's more about how obsessed you are with your vision and what are you willing to work towards to do that. So Mikhail, you mentioned it was a lot of your one path. What is this so what? Like, how do we apply this to our lives now?
Yeah, I think it's really just, again, like I think all three of us have very, very good, like cool parallels, right? So one of us is working in the AGI space, which is a very long-termist industry that's, you know, that requires the like being like this huge visionary, right? Same thing goes for Zane. Zane's working on a book to understand understand what he wants from education. And for me, it's like, you know, getting to that level in which we can create that killer application of neurotechnology and get it to a level in which, you know, it's in the hand of every consumer, right? So every single one of us has these parallels and our own individual truths. And this is where it gets exciting, because now where you know, the will to power comes into play is our ability to overcome ourselves and overcome what we think we're capable of and what's really deep inside of ourselves, and try to get to that higher level and try to.
How do we do that?
Well, first of all, it's like vision alignment, right? So being able to understand what our vision is, and then from there, trying to understand the quantifiable steps in order to get to that higher level. And
so what are the steps? Okay, like let's very, very basic example. Let's say you're doing about like personal fitness, right? The most concrete example, it's the point of reps, the point of increasing your limits, all that's very prevalent. How do you apply the concept of will to power in order to increase your willpower for how much weight you can bench, or in order to get to a healthy state of body?
Yeah. So the way I look at will to power is like a domino effect. So it's various different, like there's the will to power is that starting action, right? It's that starting action that then triggers a bunch of actions that follows, right? And so really it's about just starting and like going on that journey to achieve your vision, right? It's as simple as that. It's about, you know, starting off at that initial step and understanding what that initial step looks like, that will then trigger like a wide array of different actions that follows in order to get to that level. I think that's really the only way I can think of we can use will to power because that's sort of how I think it's more so about just being self-aware and understanding like what the will to power is than actually applying it. But I may be wrong. I'm interested to hear what you guys say.
I think what's interesting about what Ahan mentioned earlier is the more you understand your vision, the more obsessed you are with your end goal, the more willing you are to sustain pain in order to get there. And when you are visionless, or when you don't understand why you're doing something, you can bounce because to you it doesn't matter enough. There's no greater pull in order to get there. And so the way that I'm thinking about it now is similar to just any board game where you go from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. What you're compelled by is how can I get to level 100? Or even within our own different spaces, it's how do I get to a level where I can be more than just someone who writes Medium posts, but I can be a thought leader in this industry and someone that's moving the needle on the global progress of our specific discipline. And it's because we are so compelled there that all of the nights that we're spending researching, or we're not feeling well, everything that we're doing, we're still so obsessed with the goal that none of the pain in the middle matters at all to any of us. It's just we are so in pursuit of the power over the education or AGI or BCI space. We are so obsessed with that one idea that nothing in the middle matters, or at least none of the pain actually matters.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's interesting. But I think that we've circled around that several times. And so I'm curious to hear if we have any other questions around it, or any other items around will to power, or if we've exhausted this one.
I think that's really what it is, right? And I want to double down on that because actually I think that was really beautifully said because it needed to be said. That's all it really is. It's just that ability to gain that level of obsession with your goals to then work out and be able to endure much more pain than anyone else. And that's really what's going to get you and allow you to level up.
I think will to power, it plays beautifully in the transition between motivation and discipline, because motivation starts out as a lot of people have motivation when it's early on, day one mentality, you're motivated to do something. But I think having enough will to power is allowed that you are, like Zane said, you're so obsessed with your vision that it becomes a habit, becomes a discipline that you now don't need motivation to continue because it's discipline. You have the discipline instilled in you to work towards that vision, which is to endure through all the pain and struggle. So I think it's more that will to power, although it is like the initial activation, it's the activation into discipline, not the activation into motivation. That's just step 2. That's what I view it as. I think it also relates when it goes more practical to like the idea of deep work, because deep work is more like specific work you're doing to act on your long-term goals, right? So when it comes to motivation, will to power, discipline, all these things, the long-term goals, all the things we should be doing on a day-to-day basis are things that are contributing to our long-term goals. School is one that a lot of people don't like now, but if your end goal is to go to a good college, end goal is even to get to, if you need certain knowledge that can only be acquired by a good college, then your end goal is to get the knowledge, but school is a step you have to take in order to get there. So that's why I think it's better to view everything you're doing as in terms of your end goal instead of day-to-day, because day-to-day has a lot of ups and downs. And that's what Nietzsche talks about as well, is that life is existing, right? You got to go through ups and downs. He's like, suffering is inevitable. It's more just finding meaning in that suffering. But the actual concept of will to power is not you're just living to exist. You're living because you're working to your end vision. So everything you should do in the day should be contributing to an end vision. So if you brush your teeth, that's your end goal is getting a healthy body, having healthy teeth, healthy oral hygiene. If you're going to school, your end goal is to get knowledge, is to increase your knowledge in common areas like math, English, or to work the end goal. If you're going to work out, you're not working out, which is pain for one day. You could be watching Netflix. If you're working out because you want a healthy, fit lifestyle that's sustainable for the long term, right? Or you're avoiding health effects. So it's more zooming out and less day-to-day struggles, more just discipline for long term.
That's how you use and capitalize on will to power, right?
Yeah, that's how you take this abstract concept of, it's the first step, but in my, like I said, second step after motivation, and you use it to turn motivation into a habit. Because so it should always be, look at things, why are you doing this? And why are you doing it in the long term? And then view every day as that. And it's more, and once you get deep enough, like I know it's difficult for us now. Like I remember, Mikhail, we were talking about this a lot, but when you're reading a research paper last year, it was hell. Like it was so difficult, made no sense. But now I know, Mikhail, you spend the whole phase where you're just completely reading research papers. That's like just the step you take. And it's difficult. And you could be watching Netflix, could be doing other stuff. but you don't even think of it as difficult now because you're thinking of how can I get more knowledge? Why do you need more knowledge? In order to get next level BCI. And it's just an endless cycle. And it's all, and as you're doing that, you're building up your will to power for more of these areas.
And that's what the first part of it, the word is. It's literally, it's just the statement. It's like with the will to do something, right? And before, like going back to what I was talking before about like how, you know, there's like the strong morality, and then there's also that like weak morality, right? And those like that table of values. I think that's interesting because that exactly plays into discipline, right? So if I have a weak morality and like you know and a weak set of table of values, then I'm going to be taking those like roundabout and like cunning ways in order to get to my end outcome. Even though I know what my end outcome is, it's not as strong. And so I will start to watch Netflix. I will start to do X, Y, and Z, and you know, conform to various different stimulation devices because my morality is not as strong. I don't have enough vision alignment in order to actually fulfill those actions and know what's right and wrong, right? And that's what will to power is. It's just that overall idea of like every single decision that you're making, it will to power influences it, or it's that step to get to actually making that decision.
Well, yeah.
Will
to power is like, well, will to power is, I think, the driver behind transformation as well, whether it's transformation from like man to Ubermensch or the next even transformation from slave to master. It's will to power, whether it be the energy, it's what actually allows you to focus solely on, and you continue to build. Like it's like willpower. Willpower, I think, came from the word will to power, but it's how strong are you willing to do this one thing that then upgrades your morality, upgrades. And if in the case of Ubermensch, I think in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he brings up several values as they're crossing the metaphorical gate, is how strong is your will to power to achieve and live by these virtues is then what allows you to transform into the Ubermensch. So will to power is, I think, the activator for transformations to long-term goals.
Yeah, and also I think the key word would be like distinguish yourselves from others as well. It's like gaining like those parallels in order to like, and I think that's a really real thing that's really important to double down on, is that ability to like distinguish ourselves from others by carrying out on our will to power and then trying to get to that higher level.
Wouldn't that happen naturally though, because everybody's end goal and vision is different?
Yeah. So will to power, and that's what like the will to power.
It's an internal concept. I think it's gonna be independent for each person, but the only thing you can relate it, because like metaphor, if someone's end goal is like a healthy lifestyle, they work at the gym 7 days a week. Someone's is to become professional Netflix watcher. I don't know if that's a thing. If it is, then all their will is into how can I watch more Netflix per day? How can I consume content? Whatever the thing is. Yeah. So it's I don't think you can go to the topic of comparisons or thing, because everybody's is innate different. And even like in Thus Spoke Zarathustra's reading, he says that everybody should only live by one virtue. And that virtue, I think, is your obsession with your end goal of what essentially, okay, it's hard to phrase it. What is your will to power willing? Like what is being will? What are you being willed to by your will to power? Is like the one virtue.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. It's like will to power, like everyone has like various different like end points that they want to reach. And will to power is about like innately, like it's independent to everyone, is about distinguishing yourselves and being as unique and above everyone else.
Will to power, will to power is innate. It's the will to life. It's gonna be innate, because even if you don't do stuff, you're gonna like you mentioned, an analogy of plant to grow, to reproduce, to like strive for nutrients, sunlight, whatever. That's innate. But that's like the very low level will to power. Your will to power upon your goal is built up, it's developed, and that's what differentiates by how much will to power you have and how much are you willing to use that will to power to convert into actions like onto your long-term goals
that are also net benefit too, because you can say that we can make the case that every prowler, prowler is a universal term. Every prowler, a person that conducts crime, they have a will to power. they need whatever materials are in the car or in whatever facility to then live. And so you can say the same thing for every person. I think what's interesting is how that will to power manifests. Is it in a net benefit? Is it in a net loss? And then what's the scale of that? And that scale also depends on how compelled, to your point, Han, how compelled they are to use their will to power, and how compelled they are to continue to build upon their will to power. And so, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I have a question now. So it's interesting because a lot of the time we've talked about like mimetic desires and like mimetic theory and like all of that.
Okay, before we move on that, let's action items from will to power, because we're going back to so what in your life. I think the main one for me is what I mentioned before, is zooming out and viewing everyday tasks, everything you're doing as one step and along your way that you're acting on the will to power for the long-term goal. So that also means if it's not directly contributing to your long-term goal, then it shouldn't be there. Right? Like obviously you'll take time to develop your will to power, develop the discipline. But if your end goal is fitness, you don't think of, oh my God, I don't want to work out today. You think of, how badly do I want a healthy body? How badly do I want to have a sustainable lifestyle? This is just one thing I have to do to get there. So it even goes back to stoicism again. It's just like, don't view things day to day, because nothing is good or bad. It's everything is needed for your end goal, for your will to power on this end goal. But one action item from everybody.
Yeah, that's actually such a good point, because like it's again, it's about like making those like those decisions in order to have those decisions to then have like that then would lead to some form of net positive in your life, right? And then also like doubling down on that, it's about like understanding like where you need to be in order to like you get the point. But like
become an action item for you.
Okay. But yeah, it's the same thing as you. It's about identifying what my table of values are, and like what my principles are, to get to that higher level, so that I can then use those principles to create some form of autonomy in my life, that would then allow me to quickly to have that will to power much easier and much more efficiently, because I'm using these principles as a guiding force to make decisions and for my will to power in general. And that would then allow me to make better decisions and not conform to various different stimulation devices.
Autonomy, such a fire word, doesn't it? Autonomy, will to power to autonomy to discipline. I think that's the cycle I with you, because once you get to a level of autonomy, it's discipline. Like if you're doing stuff right away, you don't even think about, I don't want to brush my teeth, goes through nobody's mind now, because it's autonomy. You do it 4 times a day, and then like that's what you should be, is with school, with everything, is just do it heads down for the end goal. Okay, is there an action item from will to power before we move on to Mikhail's point about mimetic desires?
Han, you have like 5 things to tweet after this. So many different quotes, buddy. So for me, I think it's interesting because I do some weekly retrospectives, and those are just, okay, let's reflect on the week. But I haven't really thought about what it would look like to self-audit for this specific characteristic of will to power within the week, of how many things did I give up because I wasn't willing to endure the short-term pain. So I don't know what the examples are right now, but even thinking more long-term, there were things that I wasn't willing to do in order to actually play college lacrosse. Even though that was the goal and that's what I was obsessed with, there were parts within it where I said, okay, I don't want to lift weights, even though everybody around me, including the coaches I wanted to go play for, told me, Zane, you have to lift more if you want to come play at our school. So what are the things that I'm thinking about that I don't want to do in the short term? And how are those becoming opportunities that are missed or I'm not taking because either the long-term vision isn't compelling enough for me to do this short-term action, or I'm not disciplined, or I don't have enough will to power to then work towards that. And I think self-auditing that on a week-to-week is interesting, because there are even concepts right now. Part of why Innovate was so interesting to me last year was there were different concepts technically that I didn't really want to get into, because I didn't want to go through the short-term pain of I'm not going to know how to code when I first look at programming. So it's going to be so hard, but I'm just going to say, okay, I won't do it, come in and to activate. And now I'm going, I should have done that last year, but I didn't do it last year because I was too short-term oriented, where it wasn't about having a will to power and enduring the mental pain of learning something new. It was about how do I stay as hedonic as possible? How do I stay just as quick as possible so I can move into everything that seems fun and doesn't have as much pain as I'm initially thinking? Because it's interesting, the quote, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, is I could have taken that pain, but now I'm suffering for it, or at least mentally for the past couple months, I've been suffering because of it. So suffering mentally of going, I should have done this versus that, but the pain I knew whether I was going to learn it last year or whether I was going to learn it this year, I was going to have to learn it. But I opted for, no, I don't want to suffer now. Let me suffer later, or let me endure the pain later.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it's like becoming that perfect and like transcending yourself through the possession of like of whatever you want to do, and like getting to that higher place. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
But yeah, so my question is surrounding now. So we've established that the will to power is about distinguishing ourselves as unique and above others, as well as getting to a level in which we want to get to a higher like area, and distinguishing ourselves and becoming more unique is a byproduct of that, right? And my question is, why do we sometimes strive to become a part of a group? Like, why do we seek some kind of similarity to others? Because I feel like that may be a contradiction of will to power. And I have a few points to touch on this, but I want to hear your point of view, because right before this conversation, Zane brought up a point of like mimetic desires. And then I started thinking about that, because realistically, I think that obviously mimetic desires is about like, you know, basically replicating other people's desires, right? The people around you in your environment. And so isn't that the complete opposite of what will to power is all about? And this is like a devil advocate question. So
well, maybe
yeah, I think
mimetic desire. Yeah. You can
I think it's I think it's more about just the easy way out. And the reason is because it's a lot about mimetic desires, is that no matter how challenging the task may be initially, is that if you're not focused on your will to power, not focused on any of that, and everybody around you, their will to power is similar, as in the easy example of school, right? School, even though grade 10, 11, let's say grade 12 is not easy, but it's not difficult. Let's say it's not like easy, like it's not easy. It's okay, like, let's say school is not easy, but it's the easy way out, because everybody around you is so developed and all theirs will to power is on how can I optimize for school, that now you fall into this rhythm that everybody's doing school, I have to do school, and then it's easy way out compared to come back. Okay, Zane talk. I need to further
so fundamentally, mimetic desire is doing things mindlessly because the people around you are doing it as well. So I think mimetic desire manifests, number one, because it's simple. It's simple to do what everyone else is doing, where you don't have to think or you don't have to make any decisions. Makai's learning BCIs. That's so cool. I want to learn BCIs too. Well, why am I doing it? There is no question of why, because the other people in the group think that it's socially valid or think that it's globally valid. And so since it's validated by other people, I think maybe it's not predictable. Maybe it's the validation of others that we are just more inclined to. And so because other people are validating that this idea is interesting or this topic of conversation is interesting, we also feel the need to do that as well. So
but so mimetic desires, and from what my understanding is it's a biological innate thing that we all do, right? And I think every single person who's successful has fallen into the trap of mimetic desires, right? Like a random example would be like a hippie, right? Or like a motorcycle driver, and like how they all have like long hair and like leather jackets and leather pants, whatever, right? Like something like that, right? In which, you know, that's a thing. And then I think the point that I'm trying to make here, and this is sort of what the conclusion that I want to come to was that we root ourselves in easy to spot groups to only break away from them. So,
but that's part of, I think, what all of our lives are, where we're born, like you mentioned, we have biological positives and biological negatives, and I think part of our life, we spend maybe 10 to 15 or X amount of years on aggregate breaking away from the bad habits that we biologically have. They're innate. We have no control over them. So one thing that Charlie Munger was talking about was actually this idea of mimetic desire, exactly what you mentioned, and exactly how you articulated it as well, with the biological nature of mimetic desire. We don't have the ability to choose that, but we spend some part of our life just fighting against it. What other desires do we have that we spend part of our life just fighting against? So that way, once we put those behind or we train ourselves out of those items, we can then focus on all of the biologically positive things that we can do. So just a tangent based on what you were mentioning, but I think it's interesting.
Don't think it's a bad thing, and that's sort of what I'm trying to get at. It's like people make sense of who they are by forming an opinion based on a known stereotype. So like, and we rise above those stereotypes in a show of will to power to then become an individual again. And that distinction, right? That distinction comes from like this distinction from others goes all the way down to the tiniest level, right? In which now, like I'll give an example about me, right? Like in order to understand what exactly the necessary steps were to iterate on a neuroimaging modality and why that's the most powerful way of making an impact in the neurotechnology space, right? I didn't come to that conclusion myself, right? I started off by formulating opinions based off of the people that I look up to. And that person was Brian Johnson, right? So I listened to various different talks. I listened to his podcast. Podcast was a huge factor in me trying to understand and wrap my head around why Kernel is probably one of the best companies in the neurotech space right now. And why what they're working on is much more impactful than any other company in the space right now. Because what they're doing is they're actually creating this neuroimaging modality device. And then from there, I was like, okay, what can I do? Right. So now I've sort of like I've created, I started by replicating what they were doing, which was Eckner's white paper. I was like, oh, I need to join this company in order to make impact, blah, blah, blah. Right. But then I started like branching away from that. And I started to draw parallels from that. And I started to identify, okay, maybe this is not where I want to be. Maybe I want to start building off of my own neuroimaging modality and stuff like that, right? And that's where I want to be. I want to actually start by building that killer application of neurotech. And then I started building like talking points around that and trying to understand it at a much deeper level. But it was first by replicating the people around me and the people that I looked up to that then allowed me to break away from not even that stereotype, but that replication process to then become, to then be on my way to become a higher individual. I think that's really interesting because like, I think that's where will to power comes into, right? It's about the rise above these stereotypes or these replications or whatever, in a show of will to power. So our will to power to break through these stereotypes to become that individual again. So like at the time when we join this group, we're not an individual, but we're learning and we're identifying the different parallels in order to actually branch away from that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I wonder now from a more organizational standpoint, whether or not they do reflect on this, whether or not they reflect on the goals of the individual versus the goals of the company, and not just if there's alignment, but if every individual has the same goals of the company, is there any independent thought happening? Meaning if I wanted to learn everything about BCIs, if Dave wanted to learn everything about BCIs, if everyone else in the group wanted to learn about your technology, or we wanted to learn about something else, are we actually thinking independently, or are we overcome by mimetic desire and now we're not making those decisions that we should be making, or we're stereotypically thinking about here's what a successful person looks like, and so let's just follow everything that they do, meaning we go and become engineers or we do XYZ, and then eventually we'll reach that place. But number one, I think following that path of just here's what successful people do, let's go do this, that mimetic desire doesn't usually work, because those successful people do things that we don't see or we don't know. And so because everything's invisible, there's no actual path to getting there. And then second one about just the overall group and the different desires there, I think that's interesting as well, just to reflect in organizations of, is what you're thinking about actually what you think, or is that what other people think? And then that's just become your desire now. So you've just inhibited that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really well said. Because again, it's about like that, because what will to power allows you to do is the main driving force is like, I think individuality is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also think that replicating other people allows you to develop that level of individuality.
Mm-hmm.
It's a stepping stone to and that strive for individuality is when you're actually capitalizing on that will to power, because then
and it's also counterintuitive too, because you wouldn't expect that you start out mimetically desiring what everyone else is desiring, or that same goal, and then you work there forward to then what you actually want. But it's through the process of mimetic desire where then you discover your actual desires.
Yeah. Because again, like it comes back to this point, like no new idea is actually new, or like no new innovation is actually new. It came from somewhere. It came through a line of thought or experience that then formulated this completely new concept, or this person creating something completely new, right? I think it's around the same thing, right? It's like you gain inspiration that then drives your motivation and your willingness to actually do the thing that you want to do.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Okay, you got a closer?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Zane, Mikhail, and Ahan podcast. It was a pleasure having you on this journey with us as we explore the concept of the will to power. And this is Mikhail Haji signing off. Bye-bye.